this time we are going to talk about the post-exilic period again. We had talked about the period in exile. We had talked about the beginnings of the Persian period last time. This time we're going to look at the 4th and the 3rd centuries BCE. First book we want to look at is Ruth. The ones that we're going to be talking about tonight are Ruth and Esther and Song of Songs, Lamentation, Ecclesiastes, the final additions to Job, the book of Jonah, the book of Proverbs, the book of Psalms. Show of hands of who thinks we're going to get through all of them this week. So, basically, this handout is for this time and next time. But there's still one book left to do even after all of these, and that's the book of Daniel. It's the last one to be written in the Hebrew canon. And it's written about, 156 BC. It sounds like it's in the Babylonian period, but it was actually written during what we call the Greek period, the Hellenistic period. But let's go to Ruth. In the book of Ruth, it doesn't name the author. It doesn't say this is, by Ruth, but Ruth is the main character there. In fact, tradition says that it should be with the prophet Samuel, who was back in the 11th century, around the year 1000 BC. But the identity of Ruth as a non-Israelite makes it something very important. Because they're saying, look, here's Ruth, the grandmother of David, and she's from Moab. She's not an Israelite. And yet she has to be included. And look at how important her inclusion is. You don't have the great king without her. So it becomes a very big deal. The attitude towards foreigners, especially in the 5th century BC, was pretty harsh. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah is basically saying, you got a foreign wife that you picked up in Babylon? I don't mean picked up like, big sailor. I mean that you married in Babylon, send her home. If you've got children with her, send them home. This is when we start also seeing those laws about don't mix don't mix the meat and the dairy on the same plate. Don't mix the same or two different fabrics in the same garment. Don't mix different kind of grains in the same fields. Don't mix all of that, which sounds pretty ridiculous to us when we look. What's the point of I got a cotton and a linen shirt. So the point is mixing. That was the point of all those laws. So Ruth is one of two books that's going to take a hard stand about the foreigner has to be included also. God's love for the foreigner is stressed. The other book, of course, will be Jonah, but we'll get to that in a bit. So because of that, most scholars are going to put this date during the Persian period, which is the 6th, almost the 5th century to the 4th century, and even could be later than that. So we look at the genealogy that's included in the book, and that's not one that they would have written before the Persian period. This is something that comes afterwards that as a result of the priestly tradition. Remember we talked about the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly writer. Well, this comes from that priestly tradition. And it doesn't add anything to the storyline. It's just, these are historical details that they wanted to include in the history of Israel that ran from Genesis all the way through what we would call 2 Kings, the book of the Kings. So is it a history? Well, more like a political parable. It's talking about the Israels of the time. It's really kind of in conflict with Ezra and Nehemiah. And the nature of this story is, from the start, looking at the names. This is one of those, in the Jewish parables, the Hebrew parables, the names become incredibly important to what the story is really all about. You look at the husband and father was Elimelech, meaning my God is king. All right, important. His wife, remember, is Naomi. Naomi was pleasing. But after the death of her sons, Mahlon, which means sickness, and Chilion, which means wasting, she asked to change her name to Mara, which means bitter. All of those are important indicators as to what the story is really all about. So the book makes reference to Moab, and that causes a lot of questions in our minds, because most of the history of Moab and the stories of Moab is all related to a hostile relationship with Israel. Moab and Israel, Judah in the south, is considered, they're enemies with each other. It's not only the hostility, but there was sexual perversion, there was idolatry, and in Deuteronomy chapter 23, it excluded an Ammonite or a Moabite from the congregation even, saying the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation, is not allowed. We'll talk about ethnic cleansing. That's a lot. Imagine, 10 generations? That would take us back to the American Revolution. Probably, yeah. Or at least the turn of the 19th century. So, despite all this, Ruth, the Moabitess, is married to a man from Judah, a Judahite, and even after he is dead, she still regards herself as a member of his family and therefore a Judahite. Then she marries another Judahite and carries a son for him, and this is the guy who becomes the ancestor of David. Now, the Mishnah, which is the Hebrew commentary on the Torah, says that only male Moabites were banished from the congregation. That's not what the text says. The text says everybody. But they were trying to find a way to make this, to shoehorn in this into their history. So, unlike the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the marriages between Jewish men and non-Jewish women were broken up, and like I said, had to go home, the story of Ruth teaches that foreigners who convert to Judaism can become accepted and well-respected Jews. Foreign wives can become exemplary followers of Yahweh and of the Torah and Jewish law. And no reason to exclude them or their children. All of that sounds like, again, shoehorning theology and law into, the whole law is called the halakha. So it includes not only the Torah, but also the commentaries and other matters of Jewish law. So in order to make the halakha okay, well, we'll just alter the story a little bit. We'll just change the interpretation of the law a little bit. Still, the bottom line for Ruth, the book is not written at the time that it's discussing. It's discussing the 10th century BC. But the time it's written is more like the 4th century BC. All of that is written, again, as a kind of a parable in disagreement with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're heavy-handed, anybody who's not Jewish, get them out. So anyway, Ruth is saying, no, absolutely not. That anyone who has been accepted into the community stays in the community. Well, then we come to the book of Esther.
I was just going to say about the book of Ruth, when she said that she was going to follow her mother-in-law no matter what.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful song that they wrote. With
Goodness, yes.
Most.
Absolutely.
And it's
That's
used
one of the
at
most...
weddings.
Yes, it is. I mean, and while it's used for a daughter-in-law, for the mother-in-law, still, the sentiment is gorgeous and is rightly used in wedding ceremonies. And I mean, the whole, your God shall be my God. Your people shall be my people. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. I think it even includes the line, wherever you die, there I will die. What a great line that is. Just beautiful poetry. And
Ron's cousins, I never knew there was a song until when she got married, and then
yeah.
that was one of the songs at the wedding.
Oh, it's a song too.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure I knew that.
Oh, I'll look it up. I've got one. I've got a...
Yeah, please do.
Oh,
Nice.
it's
Good.
beautiful. It's beautiful, easy melody.
Yeah. So, the book of Esther. Now, this is it's a wonderful book. It's a bit strange for the way it fits into the Hebrew Bible, but it was known in Hebrew as the Megillah, the scroll. It wasn't called Esther, not called the book of Esther. It was just the scroll. It was something that kind of stood apart from everything else. It was part of that third section. Remember that there is the Torah, which is the so-called books of Moses. Then there were the prophets, which were the book of the 12, and also Psalms was even included in the book of the prophets. But this section, Esther comes from the book called, or the section called the Ketuvim, or the writings. The writings would include Esther, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, books like that. And it's one of the 5 scrolls in the Hebrew Bible called the Ketuvim, and later, of course, becomes part of the Christian Old Testament. Okay, you know the story. It's about a Jewish woman who's in exile in Persia. Her name was Hadassah, but she becomes known as Esther. And Esther is, she gets to be queen over the Persians, and there's a bad guy who's wanting to basically commit genocide of the Jewish people, and thanks to her uncle, she steps in. Well, that whole story, it's a great story, there is a queen named Vashti. She's the wife of the king, called in the book Ahasuerus, but that's not a Persian name. And so we kind of try to figure out, are they talking about Xerxes the First? Are they talking about Artaxerxes the First? We figure it's one of those guys, but so the story says that Ahasuerus tells Vashti, hey, I'm having a banquet here for my nobles. I want you to come down in your crown and dance for them. And she goes, not going to do it. Well, you'll be banished if you don't. I'm not going to do it. And we read it and go, well, what's the big deal? He just wants you to put on your crown and come downstairs and cut a rug for the nobles and all that stuff. Yeah, when he said, come down in your crown, he meant come down in your crown only. So, bless Vashti, she goes, not going to do it. Don't care who you are. You're not going to be able to tell me that, and to posture in front of your friends that I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'm not going to do it. Well, he gets rid of her. Here's the funny thing. They at Jewish, what do you call them? costume parties, that young girls never show up as Esther. They show up as Vashti. She is one of the heroes for them because she stands her ground. Don't care if you're king or who you're going to do. I'm not going to debase myself so you can be a show-off in front of your friends. So Vashti becomes a hero that kind of gets lost to us sometimes, and she's a much more noble figure than we'd like to think. But she's now gone, and so here comes basically a beauty pageant, and Esther gets chosen as the queen. She's in exile over here in Persia. She's born in exile, and she gets chosen as the new queen. Now, her cousin, maybe her uncle, but it doesn't really matter, but a guy named Mordecai is a Jewish leader, and so he finds out there's this plot that this guy is wanting to slaughter the Jews. And so he tells her, you got the ear of the king. And she's like, yeah, if I walk in there without being invited, that's my head. And hey, this other woman just refused to dance naked and she got outed, so I'm not sure if I'm gonna. And so then he gives her the great line, perhaps you are here for just such a time as this. That is a great line that has been used over and over and over again throughout history. So she goes in to see the king. Now, if he doesn't nod his scepter towards her, then she's in trouble. But she had found such favor, she walks in, he dips the scepter towards her, and she's able to come in. And he says, ask me anything. Well, she says, you know, this guy Haman, who's kind of like a bigwig in your court, he's planning to kill all my people. Well, Ahasuerus is like, get out of here. No, he's not. She says he is actually building the gallows to hang my uncle Mordecai on. And he was like, really? Oh yeah. So she says, look, I guess you didn't know it, but I'm one of these Jewish people. And he's wanting to kill my people. And Ahasuerus is basically like, the hell he is. And ball game's over. Haman winds up getting executed on the same gallows he was building for. That's good poetic justice right there. On the same gallows that was built for Mordecai and his people, Haman is then executed there. Now, here's the problem with, not that there's a problem, but when the rabbis were wanting to put together what they were going to call their Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, they said, we got to have a couple of things. One, got to be written in Hebrew. Can't be written in anything else. Second, it has to contain the divine name of God. You remember, the divine name of God. The Hebrews would pronounce it Yahweh, but it looks like like that. Best we can figure out what that should sound like is Yahweh. So they want the books of the Hebrew Bible to include that name. Esther does not. But they also needed books that were going to support the establishment of certain festivals. And for the festival of Purim, which is a day or a celebration that celebrates the deliverance of Israel, this is the only book that does that. This is the only one that talks about that particular thing. So they celebrate Purim to show their deliverance, even victory sometimes over other nations. And so here's Esther, who had become a hero for her people. And this is the only book written during this time period, during the 4th century BC. And they were like, well, we'll take it. We'll let it go in there. It doesn't contain the divine name, but it gives us what we need for that. So the book of Esther and the Song of Songs, sometimes called the Song of Solomon, are the only books in the Hebrew Bible that do not use this name. Well, Song of Songs,
Yahweh or God.
correct, doesn't use Yahweh. Now, they can use words like Adonai or El Elyon or Elohim or something like that, and they do, but they want this specific four-letter, the tetragrammaton they call it, the divine name of God.
Wasn't that not supposed to be spoken?
That came later, but you're exactly right. I had a Hebrew professor who said whenever he would refer to this name, he would refer to him as the unnamed one, bless his holy name. It was never just the unnamed one, it always had to be bless his holy name. And it would, I mean, kind of became a test to see how many times you could get him to say it in any 5-minute period, and he never failed. This was a guy who, there was a guest lecturer there, and he was there, and I was sitting behind him, and it was kind of in an amphitheater, you know, so the seat behind is a little bit above the seat before. And so I'm watching him take notes, but I'm watching his hand move from right to left. And I kind of leaned up and looked over. The guy was taking notes in Hebrew. That's how this guy was dedicated. Rabbi Lou Silberman. He was something. So yeah, you no longer. In fact, if there were Jewish folks watching, I would not say the name. I would say Adonai, which means master. But that is considered a suitable substitute for this. Or to do like Rabbi Silberman, the unnamed one, bless his holy name. But then you guys would look at me like, what kind of cult are you in? So, you know. But yes, you're absolutely right. There came a time when you don't even say it. That's how holy it was supposed to be. So,
When they use these in the Bible studies, they never say anything about that. I mean, like, I read Esther different times in songs, different ones in songs, and not ever been aware of the fact that God isn't in there.
because of our English translation.
Yeah.
Because they will translate this into Lord with all caps, Lord.
Okay.
But what you'll see in these books is God or Lord, Lord, lowercase ord. And that just means it came from Adonai. Sometimes in earlier literature, words that get translated as Lord or Master is actually the word Baal. And that's because it's been taken from Canaanite hymns and poems and stuff like that. And yeah, they will be careful to try to change it so it doesn't look too, you know. So, where were we? So, the Jews looking at this exclusion of the divine name is a pretty serious business, but in Esther, God is working so clearly that, okay, the greatness of the story outweighs the, particular of it doesn't happen to use the divine name. So, it's Esther becomes used in the festival of Purim, still celebrated today, and it's read aloud twice from a scroll that has to be handwritten. And it's a cool thing. That's one of the things they hold on to, is that they make copies of this scroll and they will unroll it this way, and read the scroll from a handwritten text. They'll read it in the synagogue during the holiday season. They'll read it at nighttime, or actually the evening at dusk, and then they'll read it at dawn of the following day. This is a time when they give a lot to charity. They to the poor, the homeless, the needy, and they exchange food gifts. Now, can I just say, that's my kind of holiday. You could keep the toys, you could keep all that stuff, but when my grandmother had like cakes and stuff like that, that's the kind of gift I want. Well, those don't last. Nothing lasts. So let me just have this. Anyway, so Purim is a great festival for that. So the thing about Esther is that for a book that doesn't contain the divine name, a book that's supposed to be for this festival, this is the book. Esther becomes the book that was so important in the 1930s and 40s. When Jews are in concentration camps, they would read from this scroll, and here's a cool story, is that so much had been taken from them. But the rabbis and the cantors would get together and they would be able to recite the whole thing together. And somebody would write it down. It may be on old newspaper using charcoal from the stove, the wood-burning stove. But they would write the scroll and they would do it again. They would read it from the scroll. This book of somebody being raised up to deliver them from the hand of an oppressor just kept them going. And it was just, this was the thing that gave them hope. This book that we think of in only minor terms was a huge comfort to the people going through the worst time that people could ever go through. And they would read this, and yet, in the concentration camp, and I met a guy who was one of the 3 rabbis who were on the tribunal, and I may have told you this story before, but they decided God has abandoned us. For whatever purpose God had in mind, God has abandoned us. And these rabbis decided to put God on trial at Auschwitz concentration camp. Actually, not concentration camp, it was an extermination camp. And so they had the Jewish folks with them, these 3 rabbis. They listened to quotations from the scripture. And this is one of the most remarkable things in history to me, is the 3 rabbis finally pronounced, yes, we find God guilty of abandoning us to this. And now it's time for evening prayers. It's like the 3 Hebrews in the book of Daniel. We know that our God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, still we'll praise him. It was the same kind of, did God leave us here? Yeah, clearly God abandoned us to this. For what reason, we don't know, but God is still worthy of prayer and praise. Plenty of times when I've tried to keep that in mind in my life. So, that's Esther. Next, the Song of Songs. Now,
One thing about Esther, does that have to be written in Hebrew all the time?
Yeah, they do. Yep. Now, if we had, obviously the Greek Septuagint decided to translate it into Greek, and that was fine. But as far as for the festival goes, yep, that's written in Hebrew. And the bat mitzvah and the bar mitzvah, they got to read it in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Even in the time of Jesus, when Jesus, it says he took the scroll of Isaiah and he read from the scroll saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. What he's reading isn't Hebrew. He's reading the Greek Septuagint translation of it. So it was only for like the high holidays, like Purim or Passover or any of those things, that it had to be Hebrew. But in a regular synagogue meeting, it was Greek. They probably spoke in Aramaic, but yeah, these guys, we think about them as being just kind of country bumpkins. But I tell you what, they knew Aramaic, they knew Greek, they probably knew a few other things too. Here I struggle with English for crying out loud, and these guys are, it's like Mennonite kids. By the time they graduate at 8th grade, they're already speaking their own Pennsylvania German dialect. Yeah. Then they speak High German, and they speak English at 8th grade. It took me a long time to get there. 8th grade. Yeah, so Hebrew, absolutely. But in the common service, in Jesus' time even, it was Greek. And we know that because the way Matthew, for example, translates what Jesus says or quotes what Jesus says. He's quoting from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew Bible. It's not a big deal, but there was just certain terms or phrases that were clearly Greek and not Hebrew. I mean, it doesn't change theology or anything like that. It really does. But yeah, the Song of Songs. Now, the Song of Songs, man. I'm sorry, I laughed at myself because there were so many teachers I heard who wanted to describe the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, as a love letter from God to God's people. Don't see it. I mean, the whole, well, in modern Christianity, in modern Christian circles, some of these songs that pass for worship songs, I gotta admit, creep me out a little bit. Like there is one where this guy who's a friend of mine, he's in a non-denominational church, but he likes to lead the congregation in this song, quoting from Song of Songs, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth." Ain't gonna do it. I love Jesus. I love God. Don't want no lip action. I mean, I'm fine the way it is. And yet, but wait a minute, it's coming from the Song of Songs. This is talking about God. No, it's not. It's not talking about that. Somebody else, another teacher said, "Oh, this is the Holy Spirit. This Holy Spirit's love for the church." There ain't no church here. There hasn't been a church even invented yet. Jesus hasn't gotten here yet. All of these things try to interpret it as some kind of allegorical thing.
What is it? We just had some.
I'm so glad you asked. What is it?
Yeah.
It's a love letter between two young people who love each other.
Okay.
That's the ball game. Now, our whole Bible, and we're only talking about the Hebrew Bible right now, has got some history, it's got some legend, it's got some prophecy, theology, it's got all like that. Why, if it includes everything in the human experience, why wouldn't it have an expression of love between two people who love each other? And that's what the Song of Songs is. It is gorgeous love poetry. I always used to tell my young students, make sure you read it, but don't read it with the opposite sex because it gets a little hot in here. And they were like, "What? I can't wait to get home to read it." That was all it took to get them to read it.
I know.
So
I just have a hard time reading it.
It's not theological at all. It's the way these people in this age were courting each other. She talks about, I'm dark, but I'm beautiful. And everybody wants to make her African or something like that. No, when it says I'm dark, it just means somebody who's probably out in the fields. A shepherdess or something like that. And here's what he is, and this is what he does, and what he comes and says. And it's all just nice. I mean, there's nothing horrible in there.
No.
It's just people who are in love saying, when I take you to the drive-in on Friday night, this is what's going to happen, or something along those lines. It's called the Song of Songs, the Canticle of Canticles. I think the medieval Catholics call it that. The Song of Solomon, of course. And of course, that comes from the beginning line, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. All right, that's how it starts. It's one of those 5 megalot, the scrolls, also in the writings called the writings, the Ketuvim, the last section of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and it doesn't care about law, it doesn't care about covenant, it doesn't care about really doesn't mention much the God of Israel at all. It doesn't teach wisdom like Ecclesiastes does or Proverbs does. It doesn't do any of those things. It does have certain styles that looks like wisdom literature, but by and large, this is a standalone piece. But still, rather, was it talking about romantic, even sexual love between people? It says, giving the voices of two lovers, praising each other, yearning for each other, proffering invitations to enjoy. The two lovers are in harmony with each other, always nice, and they're just rejoicing in what basically God has given. Then you got the women of Jerusalem who kind of form like a Greek chorus. You remember in the Greek plays and tragedies, they would stand over and they would kind of narrate the action and tell what's going on. Well, in the same way, you got the women of Jerusalem who form this kind of chorus, and the man and the woman are talking to each other, and then you have these other narrators who are including their own observation in it. They act like the audience, they act like narrators, they act like they're filling in the story in some places. So when scholars look at this, there are kind of some differences when it comes to when exactly it was written. Some people say, the more conservative scholars say, 10th century BC, the 900s BC. No, not at all. Some will move it to the 2nd century BC, like the 100s BC. Not quite that far. In my estimation, in the 4th or late 3rd century is probably what we're talking about there. Especially because you look at some of the language there, and there's language that's included in there that would only have been known to somebody in the 3rd century. So, yeah, once again, language comes to give us a leg up there. They will read the Song of Songs on the Sabbath during Passover. And Passover, of course, marks the beginning of the grain harvest and all that stuff. And they even use it to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. And the Jewish tradition will read it as an allegory between the love of God and the love of Israel. Christianity says, it's the love of God between, God's love for the church. Again, you can read it that way, and it's a great expression of it that way, but that's not what they meant. And like I told you from the beginning, the first rule is it shouldn't mean to us what it didn't mean to them. And so for them, they're simply talking about nice Jewish boy, nice Jewish girl, they're in love with each other and they can't wait to be together. What happens after that is entirely up to them and none of my business. So they keep arguing. There's still some disunity about what's going on in the book. There are those who think it's actually an anthology of several different Jewish poems that are put together. Because a lot of times you'll have kind of a hard break in the action. It'll, I don't mean the action, but I mean the narrative of the story, where all of a sudden the scene changes quickly. The narrative changes quickly. So is it a bunch of stuff? Well, the same thing can be said of Shakespeare's sonnets. They abruptly change scene, they change audience, they change all that stuff. Still, is it coming from one person? Probably. There's probably one author involved in here. Let's see. But at this point, we don't know. Now, the Book of Lamentations. Hey, we're moving along pretty good.
Why do we think that was included in Song of Songs?
Because the rabbis had already established by this time, in the composition of the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash and all those others commentaries, they had already established this is a story about God's love for Israel. So, just like Esther was a story of God's rescue of Israel, this is God's love. Now, and that took place over hundreds of years until the year 90 AD. The Council of Jamnia said, so what book should we include? And somebody said, well, you can't include Song of Songs because, the divine name's not there. Yeah, but wait, we already took Esther. Well, it's the slippery slope argument. You do that, and now you're going to include all kinds of stuff. But this is the one that really describes God's love for us. Well, that was the winning argument, because the rabbis had already established this tradition of that's what this means. Now, here we get into the 19th century. You get into guys like Julius Wellhausen, who I mentioned before, and others like him, and they're like, no, that's not what that was about. It was something much more basic than that. But by that time, it's already been in the Hebrew Bible now for 1,000 years, 1,700 years.
You're not gonna get rid of that.
No, not by that point. Martin Luther in 1521, he's wanting to write a German New Testament. Translate the Bible into German, and he didn't want the book of James in there. But all of his friends and all of the other teachers at Wittenberg were going, but it's been in there for 1,300 years at this point. No, more like 1,200 years. Already been in there. And Luther was like, yes, but it's all about works. I don't want to include those works in there. That's Roman Catholic is what that is. And they were like, look, so Luther said, I included it out of fatigue. He was simply worn down. He even called James an epistle of straw. But you know what? It's hard to fight against church history, which is what makes, again, Luther so impressive at the Council of Augsburg when they said, so you're saying 1,500 years of church history is wrong and you alone are right? And he goes, yes, that's what I'm saying. That's my guy. God, I love that guy. They were wanting to exclude it, but
we don't use that book in wedding ceremonies or.
no, because I'd break out into a sweat reading it. We don't need that for crying out loud. But yeah, absolutely. Actually, my cousin, she and I were raised more like brother and sister, but she was marrying a wonderful Jewish guy, and so she said she wanted me to participate in the wedding. So her brother was also a minister, and my dad was there, and then me. And so she said, I'd like for you to read some scriptures in Hebrew. And I'm like, great, sure. And then we would have my dad read them in English. So, the Jewish half of the family gets the Hebrew, the non-Jewish, thank you, the Gentiles would get it. And so I said, fine, but let me pick it. And so she goes, oh, okay. Okay, so what are you going to pick? No, I don't want you to know until we're there. Okay. And I picked it from here. Her mom had just died 2 months before, and she almost called off the wedding, but everybody, even her dad, was like, don't do that. She was looking forward to this. Don't do that. So I chose from Song of Songs where it talks about the bride, and it says, she is the darling of her mother. So I read that in Hebrew. She still doesn't know. Then Dad reads it. Of course, Dad's got the great voice and all that stuff. And he goes, she is the darling of her mother. And she looked at me like, I hate you with the heat of 1,000,000 suns. Because now she's got the makeup and now she's starting to cry and all that stuff. So she called me everything but a child of God when that wedding was over with. But yeah, that was cool. So yeah, you can pick a little bit out of there when you do it, but you got to be careful. So yeah, there we have it. Now, Lamentations. Oh goodness, Lamentations actually gets stuck way earlier in the Bible, following, of course, Jeremiah. And the Lamentations is what we call it. The Hebrews called it Ekah, which it basically means how. You think about that, because Lamentations is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And the question is, how did this happen? We thought we were faithful. We thought we were doing right. We thought we were doing all these things. And yet Jeremiah himself was going, no, you're not. You're not. You're relying on the temple to save you, and it's just not. So, yeah, how? How did all this happen? It's all poems, technically laments, that are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Some people had tried to make it about the death of King Josiah back in 605 BC. 611 BC. And, but no, it's not that, because Jerusalem is specifically mentioned here. Is it Jeremiah who writes it? No, this comes later too. This also appears in the Ketuvim, the writings section, one of the 5 scrolls, as it's called, next to the Song of Songs, next to the Book of Ruth, next to Ecclesiastes, and the Book of Esther. But in the Hebrew Bible, there's no set order. You can mix them up as much as you want to. One doesn't have to come always first, and one doesn't always have to come last. In our Old Testament, we have it following Jeremiah, simply because historically we always thought Jeremiah wrote the thing, so why not have the two of them together? But modern scholarship tells us no, that's not quite the way it worked. With the destruction of Babylon the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon in 586, 587, that is the background of the poems, but they weren't written by Jeremiah. In fact, we know Jeremiah wasn't written by Jeremiah. It was written by Baruch, his scribe, his secretary. But truth is, now we look at it, and thank goodness for the discoveries of the libraries and scrolls and clay tablets of the 20th century, we're now able to definitively look at these different writings and say, this is not the same writer as this, or the same writer as that. There are distinct differences now. So Lamentations actually becomes a collection of laments about the fall of Jerusalem. Now, you look at the fall of Jerusalem in the story of Jeremiah. You look at the story of the fall of Jerusalem in the Book of the Kings, in Lamentations, and it's not always telling exactly the same story. That's okay. Because we now know there is what do they call it? Authorship under trauma. That when people have been through traumatic things, this is why people are not, eyewitnesses are not the best witnesses. They would much rather have forensic evidence or documentary evidence or something like that, because under trauma, you don't remember things the same way. If we were all, a bunch of Martians came into the room and started roughing us up and taking away our Coke Zero, and somebody else this trauma that develops, and it has to happen over a long period of time, will come out telling different stories. I mean, it'll be like, can you believe they took away my Coke Zero? What? That was nothing. They took away it. And all these things are telling the same story, but the trauma affected us differently. That's what happens in all these writers, is that trauma causes them to remember how it impacted them, what they thought was happening. So anyway, in some of the styles that are used here actually represent what's called the Mesopotamian city lament, when there were old scrolls and clay tablets that describe the fall of Uruk, or describe the fall of any of these great cities like that. And it takes on a certain style and a certain rhythm even, that that we can identify, like when we were talking about in the book of Amos, when Amos is talking about, you know, these what does he call them, the cows of Samaria, talking about these noble women and these royal women. He says you're going to be driven away like cattle and drug away on meat hooks. Horrifying enough, but the style that he's telling it in is in the style of a funeral dirge. So that's a big deal because these people hear it and they go, I know what that is. It's like hearing the Darth Vader theme. You know, we all know what that is. It's a bad guy showing up. Well, in the same way, then, this Mesopotamian city lament has that kind of impact of this gut-wrenching thing. It makes them clench up immediately. And so that's used to describe what's going on in, Jerusalem. But there's the hope to return to God. There's, but it's pretty bleak. I mean, all of it there is, we don't hear God speaking at all, which even if God is telling you you're being a jerk, at least God's talking to you. But here, there's nothing from God. That's what adds to the horror of what they're experiencing there. They're overwhelmed by this catastrophe that's going on. And do they hope for a future redemption? Yeah, but it's really kind of overwhelmed by the horror of what's going on. Still, the author makes clear that the city we've sinned, I've sinned, the authors say, sinned against God, and God has responded, and responded fiercely with this. But then, God is also just and merciful and righteous. So it's never the idea that God's a bad guy and that God is that. It's always with the idea, boy, did we mess up. And is God doing this to us, or is God letting this happen to us? Well, it's more of the latter. That Jesus said, you reap what you sow. We have sowed unrighteousness, and look what we're reaping now. So, again, laryngitis.
Glad you don't have that.
Really, Lamentations has been traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah, and that's just because, you know, they ascribing authorship to various books, and to Jeremiah in particular, comes from this idea of we got to name who the author is. And that's something that begins in the Jewish period and will continue through the New Testament. Certain books that are named certain things, we know that author didn't do that. In fact, they were, anonymous for maybe 100 years until somebody says, it looks like this reflects the teachings of this one or that one. The prophecy about Jerusalem, well, that falls right into Jeremiah's purview, and so it was no big deal to ascribe his name to it. And also, it says in 2 Chronicles that Jeremiah had been inspired to write a lament, but that lament was about the death of King Josiah. And Lamentations has nothing to do with that. Lamentations all has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. So just because 2 Chronicles said that, then people wanted to go, oh, well, here, this is a lament. But again, modern scholarship tells us that no, Jeremiah did not write Lamentations. And so Lamentations, like so many other books, just remains anonymous. And again, it was a bunch of poems being compiled together to form this one book. When was it written? Somewhere during the exile, it seems to fit in there, between the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 and then 520. But the poems also kind of reflect the language of those people who stayed in the land. Remember, when those people in exile went to Babylon, they started picking up certain Babylonian, Akkadian, Chaldee phrases that worked its way into their language. We don't find that in Lamentations. This is probably the people who had been left there. Plus, it is, it follows, okay, certain of those poems are in acrostic form, is what they call it. Psalm 118, I think, is an acrostic poem where in Psalm 118, each stanza begins with the progressing letter of the alphabet. Okay, for example, I write a poem, God save you, but I write a poem, and the first stanzas, all the lines begin with A. Second stanza, all the lines begin with B, and on and on and on. That's what an acrostic is, and these were present here in the Book of Lamentations. And they kind of follow the order, the letter ordering of Old Hebrew. In fact, some people call it Paleo Hebrew or Proto Hebrew. That goes way back, and that makes some people say these are probably not composed during the post-exilic period. Composed. When was it put together as a book? Now, that's what we're talking about. So all these different poems were existing, kind of like Job had been, that was a story that was probably the oldest story of the Bible, but now somebody has started to pull all these together and edit them, that great editor, whoever he or she may be. So the sequence of the chapters is not chronological at all. So the poems aren't necessarily written by eyewitnesses. It's just the effect that's been had on it. Imagine, could a Japanese person today write about the horrors of Hiroshima? You bet they could. And that same trauma would be there. That's kind of what we're talking about here with Lamentations also. It was written compiled probably in the time when the second temple was being built, or the Temple of Solomon was being rebuilt. Because second Isaiah, that is to say, Isaiah chapters 40 through 55, seems to quote from Lamentations. So, all right, we've got a good sense then of when to zero this in. Scholars still argue. Is it one author? Is it multiple argues? Or authors? Yeah, we know it's probably many. All right, Ecclesiastes. All right. Takes its name from the Greek word Ecclesiastes, which just means, and actually, it's kind of referring to the person who's put themselves at the center of the book, Ecclesiasticus. The Hebrew calls him Koheleth, which just means basically preacher or a speaker, a teacher. But a lot of people have gotten comfortable with calling him a preacher. That's fine. According to the rabbis, Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. When he was old, he wrote this, they say, and there was another tradition that said Hezekiah and his scribes and colleagues had written Isaiah and Proverbs and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. And what they're probably talking about there is just it was edited during the time of Hezekiah. Still, in our time, we look at it, we look at the language, we look at the references, we look at the city names, we look at places like that. And we're able to say this did not come from the time of Solomon. It came much, much later. In the Christian tradition, they want to tell us that the book was written by a different Solomon, not Solomon the king. In fact, Gregory of Nyssa, who's writing about, I don't know, when is he writing? Somewhere in the late 300s, is talking about this being written by another guy named Solomon, and a guy named Didymus the Blind said that it's probably the result of many different scholars. But how are you going to trust a guy named Didymus the Blind when he's reading a text? I mean, so I'm starting Humor Sunday early.
I'd
There-
like to know where they got all these names from, though. I mean, Didymus the Blind, where did they come up with them? Why do they name people like that? What's wrong with Joe, Bob, Ed, and Tom?
Here's my favorite. In the Middle Ages, there was a king of the Merovingian Empire named Childeric the Stupid. That's gotta be the best. I mean, there was Pepin the Short, there was, oh yeah, but Childeric the Stupid is got to be the best.
Okay, but look at all the nicknames that you have in Brentwood.
Well, yeah.
Those were put in a book.
Oh my gosh. I feel sorry for anyone reading that book.
Well, even back, was it Esther, where they named the boys
Yeah, such,
Horrid names.
yeah, such horrid
Yeah.
names.
Sickness and,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my own name. My dad, he asked his mom, I think, about, why did you give me the name Travis? And she was like, well, it was important to your father for some reason. Well, then we find out that Travis means from the crossroads. And I'm like, you realize that's a curse, right? I mean, it seems like my whole life has been at a crossroads. Or even more sinister is at the crossroads meant an encounter with the devil. And I'm like, thank you very much for that. I mean, and I've had that too, it seems like. So yeah, and the funny thing is, in Japan, they will regulate what you call your children. If you have a name like you name a child Bitter or Sickness or Doofus or something like that, then the doctor's going to have veto power and say no. And when I was there for when was I there? 2006, 7. And there was a court case because somebody wanted to name their child Evil. And the doctor went, no. And it went to the courts, and the court said, no, you don't name your child that. Wish they'd have had that around about 1958. Don't name your kid that. So, or think about in the book of Hosea, when those kids, one's named Not My People, one's named Not My Chosen, one's named, something like, what's the other one? Despair or abandonment or something like that, yeah. Now, were those names really names given to children, or was this part of the fable that was written? Probably more like that. Still in Ecclesiastes, we have a lot of these Persian words that are being used in there. We call them loan words. These Persian loan words occur there. And there's also a lot from Aramaic that's there. And so it's telling us, okay, it won't be, the writing of this won't be before the year 450 BC. And the latest possible date is 180. So it's going to be somewhere in there. So a Jewish writer named Ben Sira wrote, he quoted from it. And so we know that, okay, it was by his time, but this dispute of whether Ecclesiastes belongs to the Persian period, which we're talking about now, or even a little bit later, the Hellenistic period that we'll be talking about later, all comes around how much Greek do we see involved there. The problem is that there was a lot of Greek influence, Hellenistic influence, in the Persian court as well. Remember, Darius the First, he tries to invade Greece. Gets hammered at the Battle of Marathon. Xerxes the First will try to invade, and then you have the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. So there's a lot of influence from the Greeks into the Persians already, even long before Alexander the Great gets there. What was that? So the scholars who argue for the Persian period, they think that there's a complete lack of Greek influence there, but those who argue for the Hellenistic period says that there's a whole lot of Greek in there. Well, once again, it comes down to historians and anthropologists who are simply saying, yes, this is Greek, or no, this is not Greek. But at least we have a period that we can say no earlier than 450, no later than 180. And then the question is Koheleth, Ecclesiastes, is the preacher, is he just the narrator, or is he the narrator and the author at the same time? Well, that's been the argument there, because it switches back and forth. Can we just pause for a little while?
I thought I shut it off, sorry.
There's several times when it will shift from these third-person quotes from Koheleth to first-person reflections on his part, talking about these things that he's seen and witnessed himself. So either it's written by Koheleth or by a contemporary of Koheleth who saw all these things personally. Some say the third person is just a literary device, kind of like if I were to write a book and I'm the main character of the story, but I want to give an outside perspective, I might say, and then Travis walked into the kitchen and there were no more Twinkies and he burned the house down. Is it something that simple? Well, it may be, but we don't find a whole lot of that happening in this time period. The Greeks will certainly do it, but not until a good bit later. Some scholars said that this, they compare it to Uncle Remus. The way the Uncle Remus stories will create a false third person when actually he's talking about himself. And then again in Koheleth or in the Ecclesiastes, it looks like it's a historical person who's doing the talking. And a narrator is presenting this historical person's ideas. A lot of people say, when you read Ecclesiastes, is it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of theological significance. Reading Ecclesiastes gives us over and over again the vanity, all is vanity, which is a terrible translation of that phrase. That word vanity, which makes it seem like we're doing it to puff ourselves up, the things that we do or to make ourselves look good. No, that's not what the word means. When that word being used for vanity isn't talking about us puffing ourselves up. Vanity is actually a vapor. It's just a puff of wind. So what it's telling us is it's all a puff of wind. We work for money, it's just a puff of wind. We look to gain some kind of influence, we look for something to really puff ourselves up, when in fact, it's just vapor. It disappears with nothing left behind. That's what it's trying to tell us, because then it goes on to say, but you follow the things of the Lord. You do the things that the Lord tells you. Those are things of lasting influence. And Jesus will actually build on that theme when he's talking about the guy who's building the barns. Remember when he says, hey, I got so much stuff here, I need to build more barns. And the Lord goes, you're an idiot. Well, not in those terms, but basically, you're gonna die tonight because you're doing everything for yourself. That's the
Take it
message
with you.
of, what's that?
Can't take it with you.
You cannot take it with you. But I'm gonna try. There's certain things I want to take with me. Not money. There's a signed baseball by Brooks Robinson. I'm gonna take that with me. All right, I'll probably let one of the kids have it. But, one guy named Roland Murphy, he said that Koheleth himself would have regarded the time and the cleverness put into interpreting this book of just one more example of the futility of human effort, he says. That even Koheleth himself would go, oh, stop reading this book, would you please? I was just talking about what was going on in my head. You're spending too much time arguing over this, and yet there are scores of books written on this. One of my professors, that was his thing, Koheleth, and you couldn't even call it Ecclesiastes because he would, clear his throat in a way that lets you know, don't do that again. It was Koheleth, and yeah, it's all in all a remarkable book when you realize, that's when you need to read it with certain books, certain Bibles with good textual notes to let you know this is what it's talking about, like the one you got. So now, we look at Koheleth, and it has a 10-verse introduction, and it kind of, in that, sets up who the narrator is. It sets the mood of everything that's going to follow, and the message is that, look, all this stuff you're doing for yourself, it's meaningless. And that setup like that was first appeared in a commentary in the 13th century by a guy named Samuel Ibn Tibbon and Aaron ben Joseph of Constantinople. There's some good names for you. Not the stupid, but still. And then after this 10-verse introduction, then comes the actual story or the speech of Koheleth. He's saying, as a king, I've seen it all. I've experienced all of it. Done everything. Which is actually kind of like the way the Epic of Gilgamesh was written way back. Way back. It starts off in the Akkadian version of it. It says, he had seen everything. And then it goes through this story about his life, the things that he had witnessed, the things that he had learned, the things that he found out was wrong. And then in the end, you realize that, oh, that preamble, he had seen everything, is actually the last statement. That after you read the whole book, you realize that Gilgamesh had seen everything. In the same way, Koheleth acts just like that. Seen everything, done everything, but in the end, nothing's really reliable. And like they say, death is the great equalizer. The only good thing you can do, Koheleth says, is to enjoy life in the present, because that is from the hand of God too. Pleasure and enjoyment, love, relationships, all of that comes from God. You can't add anything. Jesus will again reiterate that kind of sentiment. Remember when he goes, by worrying, can you add 1 cubit to your stature? Can you add 1 hair to your head? No. Enjoy what you've got right here, right now. Sure, the world's got a lot of injustice in it, but God will be the judge. And don't think for a second that God and humanity belongs in the same category. It's just not going to be that way. So make sure your attitude towards God is right. Make sure that you focus on the character of God through this. Enjoy life, but don't be greedy. No one knows what's good for humanity, and no matter how much we want to gain wisdom and righteousness and all like that, it just seems to escape us. And so that's really what he's talking about, is the limits of human power. just how much righteousness do we think we can get? We can't. The righteousness we get is bestowed on us by God. Again, something that Jesus is going to tell us and something that will make a career for Martin Luther. There's lots of risk in the world. Live with it. Live with the risk. Try to minimize it as much as possible. Politics, don't trust that. God ain't got the truth. Yeah, there's some lines that we should pull from a Koheleth. Don't live for politics or economics either. And his final words there are about, look, nature dissolves, it falls apart, and humanity is on an inexorable march to the grave. But the narrator keeps going back, and he comes back with an epilogue at the end. He says, the words of the wise, they are hard, but they are applied as the shepherd applies prods to his flock, to move his flock along. In the same way, he's saying, these words are meant to move you along. Continue to do good. Continue to seek after righteousness. But just don't think it's yours. Realize that all of that comes from God. He says, fear God and keep his commandments, for God will bring every deed to judgment. Some scholars have said that verses 13 and 14 of chapter 12 were added later on by somebody who wanted to give a nice wrap up to it. It was kind of like, well, this is pretty depressing stuff. Can we add something that's going to be a little more cheerful? Well, so we don't know. The first thinker, the original Koheleth, was he willing to leave it at that? Yeah, maybe. But again, somebody later on said, you got to do better than that. Kind of like Job. You know, you couldn't leave Job with Job just sitting there in ashes and sores. You got to add something to it. You got to get him out of there. But still, others think, and actually I'm one of them, who think that it's the original guy. I think that, the language stays the same, but that could have been copied. But I think that the end is by the same guy who wrote the beginning. And now, he may have sat, put it on the shelf, left it for a few days, and talking with his wife, and she probably goes, Koheleth, that end really stinks. You gotta, I don't want to read it. So he's like, all right, well then. So, anyway, we'll see how that is. All right, we are. Let's finish. Yeah, let's finish up with the final additions to Job. So, we had talked about in the very first class about Job, and it's the oldest story. But it was in 4 parts, remember? There was, if you have section 1 being the scene where Satan appears before God, and then you have the section where Job is talking to his 3 friends. Then you have section 3 where this guy Elihu, a younger guy, shows up, and then section 4 is the final part where everything is restored to Job. It's that 4th part that will finally be added here, because it started off being section 2, then section 1, then section 3. So it starts off with, here's this guy Job, these horrible things are happening to him, and nobody can figure out why, except his friends are saying, you did something wrong. And he's like, I didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, you did. And then they were like, well, how does it start? Just this poor guy who's a good guy loses everything. How did that even start? So they add a section a couple of hundred years later where it's the Satan, which was the phrase they were using, the Satan, the opponent. The opponent appears before God and says, let me at him. All right then. And then you get section 3 where this young guy Elihu shows up, and he's just a little twerp if there ever was one. And he's like, And then God shows up at the end of that, and it always cracks me up because everybody thinks that God is attacking Job for what Job has said. That's not what's happening. Job is actually stepping in to defend Elihu because God is telling Elihu, where were you? He wasn't doing that to Job. He was doing that to this kid. I say kid, he's 20s, 30s, something like that. Anyway, and so Job, to show what a loving, kind man he was, steps in and he takes the heat for this kid. But then in the end, after everything has been said, they had this final section where God says, okay, you so-called friends. Man, it's a powerful statement. He goes, you have lied about me. Now, what cracks me up is I've been in sermons or in services where the sermon was actually lifting something out of what one of those three friends said, and they're preaching this like this is the gospel. And I'm sitting there going, but wait a minute. It's only going to be a few chapters when God says that this guy's lying. So you're basing this sermon on a lie. All right, I'll just sit here quietly and keep my mouth shut. And that's when I learned how to play Connect the Dots in the back of church hymnals. To do anything besides this. So now we have this section when God says, you guys have lied about me, and Job and I are fine. But if you want to be forgiven, you ask Job. Job forgives you, then I'll forgive you. That was the beginning of, we know that in the Jewish calendar they have a celebration called Yom Kippur, right? The Day of Atonement. That's the day when everybody gets their sins forgiven, you go before God, yeah. But before Yom Kippur, there is what they call Erev Yom Kippur, the evening before Yom Kippur. And that's the day when you have to go to others and get forgiveness from them. The idea is, don't ask God for forgiveness if someone else needs to forgive you. You get forgiveness from them first, and they go. Now, of course, if you go to them and they go, I'm not going to forgive you, well, then everything's square. Then you can go ahead and go to God. But it kind of starts with this, with the last part of Job. So here we are in the Second Temple period, and Job has been transformed over and over again. They've told bad retellings of the story. He goes from a guy who looks to be questioning everything, and then he moves to a more steadfast kind of guy. And then they turn on his wife, and that's one of the things that just ticks me off more than anything. Somebody one time it was a minister's meeting. That's why I quit going to those. And it was in a minister's meeting, and this one minister was talking about, well, if Job had a different wife, things might have been. What did you say? Well, yeah, Job's wife is a source of problem. I said, hey, Job's not the only one who lost children. Job's not the only one. Job's not the one who's watching the love of his life dissolve in pain and agony. Job's not what are you talking about? And he goes, well, he says that she's a foolish woman. No, he said, you're talking like the foolish women. Well, he's saying she's saying he should curse God. No, it was like suicide by cop. They believed in the ancient world, if you cursed God, you drop dead right then. She was telling him, this horror has got to end. I hate seeing you go through this. Why don't you just commit suicide by cursing God, and mercifully it will all be over with. And that's why he goes, that sounds like the foolish women talk. But in the end, everything is restored to the two of them. He doesn't lose his wife, and she's the one who is just suffering so horribly with him. This is a two-part story. I mean, somebody should write, the testament of Job's wife or something like that. Probably somebody has somewhere. But so misunderstood, and now he suffering this test of obedience and virtue. He's accounted as righteous before God. And the whole idea of sanctifying Job, turning him into this, the patience of Job that we all hear about all the time, it starts with the Greek Septuagint version, when they were making their translation somewhere around 200 BC. And then there was another book called the Testament of Job that was written either in the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD, which that's where we get the hero of patience all about. It's coming out of there. And they wind up not paying a whole lot of attention to the dialogue that goes on in the book. But that tradition actually gets picked up on by the Epistle of James. James is going to use that in the New Testament. And James gives us Job as the enduring, patient believer. That's in James chapter 5. Well, like I said, God tells Eliphaz and the other two guys that you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done. These three, plus Elihu, who is the critic of Job and his friends, not mentioned in here, they're told to make burnt offerings with Job as their intercessor. It says, the quote is, "For only to him will I show favor." So, Job is restored to health, got his money back, got his family back, or gets a family, and lives to see his children to the 4th generation. But it's not a happy ending. I mean, sure, he gets stuff back, but there's no replacing the children that he's lost. You don't replace that. Only people who do not have children have ever been heard to say to a bereaved mother or father, "Well, you can always have more kids." Man, that just makes you want to just drop kick somebody. There's no replacing them. Yes, we have all these other children. Yes, these daughters are the most beautiful in the land. Yes, I've got all this stuff. But the price of loss is horrifying. I mean, no parent, it's become a saying in our society that no parent should ever have to bury a child. And Job and his wife understand that better than anybody. Is it a happy ending? No, but it's at least resolved. 7 o'clock on the nose. I'm getting good at this. So then